kind of discuss everything in its entirety. And if you have any questions, right, I will post up the remaining amount of material for chapter 11 on YouTube and link to it. And I will post all of the chapter 12 stuff as well once we're done with it, right? Now, our next thing to, probably you guys, big picture wise, what's due next and what do you have to really study for? The big picture wise is right now, I want you guys to focus in on your lab practical, right? Look at models that I have. I try to get as many pictures of models as I can because that's what, it's easier to see. I do have a cadaver on there, but it's only on stuff that we discuss and that we can't really see on the model. So hint, there's a muscle that's on there that we didn't really, I think we discussed it in terms of you can't see it in a model. So, make sure that you kind of understand that for us that, if we have this, I said that we don't want to, kind of focus in on some things that aren't there, right? You might see it on the cadaver then. All right, let's get started. And I'm going to share our desktop. And hopefully it's been recording. Perfect. Okay. Oh, where's my PowerPoint? Right here. You guys can see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, guys, if you don't, please tell me. I think in one of my classes, nobody mentioned anything. So for like 35 minutes, I guess you guys were just, some of the, students were just seeing either a blank screen or, God forbid, me and my, big self and my non-haircut in about 3 months. So yeah, it's kind of brutal to look at. Let's take a look at chapter 12. At this point in chapter 12 is all about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, right? So what we're going to see in terms of chapter 12 is discussing what is a spinal nerve, what is found in the spinal cord. So we want, in terms of the spinal cord and the spinal nerve, to be able to look at those and understand, right? Keep in mind, the spinal cord is incredibly important. It's going to contain all of the different sensory sensations, sensory, right, signals coming up from your body. And those sensory signals are then going to go up the spinal cord, cross over, and then go to the other side of the brain. So all sensations have to travel up the spinal cord. Now, saying that, all motor signals always comes from on top, and they always descend down the spinal cord. So it's like the super highway of information going up for sensation and coming down for motor signals. That's what makes it incredibly important. That's why if you have a problem where the spinal cord gets damaged, right? What happens is you don't really need to separate it. All you have to do is just kind of hit it really hard. Your spinal cord is, people compare it to jelly. It's even softer, right? I want you to think of this as something that is more malleable, right? I know I'll probably link you guys up to a video where this woman is going to have a cadaver brain and a cadaver spinal cord of a person that just passed away. So fresh that there's still blood on it. And what happens is the spinal cord is about the size of our pinky. Not only is it the size of our pinky, the width of it, it also is much, much, much more malleable and much softer and much more fragile than any finger. So I want you to think of, if you have something like a piece of ground beef, right? And you keep pushing on that piece of ground beef, that's about the extent of the toughness of our spinal cord. In other words, it's very soft, right? Any kind of ground turkey, ground beef that's already been cut up and mushed together, it's very soft when you touch it. That's a consistency of our spinal cord. It's that soft. In other words, it's incredibly fragile because of it. And when we look at it and it's so fragile, it also means that's a reason why, right? It's a reason why we need to make sure we don't damage it at all. So let's take a look at the spinal cord over here. Whoops. When you take a look at this, this is one cluster of spinal nerves. And what we're going to see is all of this white are the myelinated portions of the nerve, of the neuron. So neurons that are white are the axons that are covered with myelin sheathing. And you can see just how many there are. So when we talk about a nerve, like for your, lab practical, it's going to contain nerves. So your musculocutaneous, your median nerve, your radial, your ulnar nerves, all those nerves are all very important, but these are all not just from one neuron. Keep that in mind, right? Each nerve is going to be different motor signals coming from your brain to your fingers, different sensory signals going in the opposite direction. So when we have something like the median nerve and you have carpal tunnel, you not only get the problems that are loss of sensation, right? But you also have loss of motor signals, and people feel weaker in the fingers and even in the palms and even in the fingers as they try to move it and flex it downwards. Why? Because when you trap that median nerve, the signals for motor comes up. Now it doesn't get through because it's trapped. And because it doesn't get through, you can't activate the muscles with as much strength. Now it makes sense that if that occurs, you're also trapping signals as it comes downwards. As it comes downwards, then we're gonna have less signals able to go through that narrowing of the carpal tunnel. And what happens then? You have less sensation and you'll have the numbness, the pinprick sensations that we see in carpal tunnel. In other words, a nerve that is like the median nerve, or even something even larger like the sciatic nerve. Well, those nerves are huge. And because they're so big, they're carrying lots of sensory and motor signals. It also means that it's not just one or two axons coming down. They're going to be millions of these different axons coming down and then helping form the nerves. Now, in terms of the spinal cord, it is not uniform in shape. In other words, it's not just one size on the way down. As it comes down, you see enlargements. The cervical enlargement, and then it narrows down and it turns into the lumbar enlargement. Now, when I'm asking you guys to kind of look at things, I want you guys to understand that there are reasons why things are the way they are. Why do we have a cervical enlargement? Why do we have a lumbar enlargement? Here's cervical, here's a lumbar. At the same time, in the thoracic region, the spinal cord is really narrow, very small. The difference is this, and this is why, right? In the cervical region, you're gonna have your arms. So you're gonna have a lot of information coming in from your upper extremities, from your fingertips. You have a lot of sensitivity there. So you have a lot of neurons coming in from your fingers that are sensory. And they're gonna come in from the spinal cord, from the nerves. As they come in, it makes sense, you need more area of the spinal cord for those nerves to enter. So those nerves and the spinal cord here are very large because you have a lot of sensory signals. And then because you have a lot of fingers and a lot of muscles in the arm, you have a lot of motor signals as well. So it makes sense why we have a cervical enlargement, because you have more muscles. Now, compare the muscles of the arms that you have to memorize and the numbers of them, compare it to the muscles of your chest and your abdomen, right? There aren't a lot of those. So it makes sense in the areas that don't have a lot of sensitivity, right, in terms of motor signals and sensory signals. Well, those areas are gonna have less nerves to have to go through. And the spinal cord is very small, right? In the chest, all you have is the chest, all right? All you have is your, the muscles of the chest, pec major, pec minor, the muscles of the abdomen, right? Now, there isn't a lot of sensitivity as well required there. So you don't need that kind of fine motor control, or you don't need that fine sensory sensation as well. So the spinal cord in the thoracic area are very small. And then as it comes down, it enlarges again. Why? well, lower limbs now, right? So the lumbar sacral area allows us to have the sciatic nerve, right? And the sciatic nerve is huge, and it's got the femoral nerve on front as well. So those nerves are going to be moving your leg muscles as well as your toes. It's also receiving a lot of sensory stimuli from those regions. And again, you have a lot more muscles in your legs than you have in the chest and abdomen region. Because of that, you have more muscles that have to be innervated, and you need more motor neurons to come out. Makes sense, you need more spinal cord area then. So lumbar enlargement and the cervical enlargement coincides with the increased sensitivity for sensory stimuli and increased motor control for motor stimulus in your arms and legs. Now the spinal cord then tapers down to a tip. Your spinal cord ends between L3 and L4. Now, in some people, it's a little bit earlier, some people a little bit longer, but usually before the sacrum, right? Usually between L3, L4, L2, L3, the spinal cord right here ends. And there's a little bit of space right here, and you no longer have a true spinal cord at that point. Now, it tapers down to a point, and we call that tapering area where it makes a point the conus medullaris. So it looks like a cone. Now, what we see in the spinal cord is the spinal cord right here ends at the conus medullaris, but that does not mean that you don't have nerves that exits. I want you to think of the spinal cord again as a highway, super highway. If you guys have been to like a big city like Chicago, Atlanta, they have lots of huge, huge, many lane kind of freeways. Why am I comparing it? Well, the freeways are going to be carrying a lot of different cars going back and forth. So just like the spinal cord, it's going to be carrying a lot of information up for sensation, down for motor function. Now, why am I mentioning it as well? Well, as we end right here, right, we still need to have motor signals and sensory signals for the legs. So even though the spinal cord ends, we still have spinal nerves that has to exit out, right? So what happens is that this area where the spinal cord ends, but yet individual spinal nerves exits out, that's called the cauda equina, or the horse's tail. If you've ever seen a horse's tail, a lion's tail, right? They've got an area that's kind of meaty in the middle, and then hair is coming out, right? In terms of the horse, it's really noticeable, right? So then the tail ends, but lots of hair comes out and shoots out of the tail. So that's what we see at the end of our spinal cord, is that you have this physical endpoint right here, the conus medullaris, but you still have spinal nerves that exits out. Now, the spinal nerve itself, come back here, right? Here's a spinal nerve. And what a spinal nerve is, are signals that are sensory, right? In that segment of the spinal cord. So let's come back here to that picture right here, right? So let's say we're looking at this segment of the spinal cord, or even in the thoracic area, right? So these are spinal nerves that exits the spinal cord. Keeping our analogy intact, right? Your spinal cord is a highway. Information goes up, information goes down. But what would happen if you have an exit on a highway that's closed? If you have a highway on an exit that's closed, that information can't get out. You can't get that information in either. So what happens? You blocked that exit, right? That's what happens when you have a pinched nerve. When we have a pinched nerve, we have a pinch and then spinal nerves as it exits out of the spinal cord. Those spinal nerves carries the information from the medial part of the spinal cord out towards your arms. So if it's a motor signal, the spinal nerve allows motor neurons to exit out and then goes to that target muscle. So if you get damage in the spinal nerve here, those motor signals can't go out. And now you don't have motor control of the muscles you should. And you have either loss of function or complete paralyzation. At the same time, spinal nerves also carry sensory signals in. Again, right, just like a superhighway, right? What happens? You need exits and you need entrance ramps. Well, the spinal nerves are your entrance and exit ramps. Entrance ramp, so then sensations from your limb, right? Let's say from your arm, deltoid area, right? That's gonna, all those sensations from your deltoid area will be carried up the cervical spinal nerve and then enter the spinal cord, where then it makes contact with other neurons that carries that message to the opposite hemisphere of the brain. So what happens is the spinal nerves themselves are what links your spinal cord to the target region. So in the cervical area, the target region are your upper limbs. So when we look in the cervical area, right, if you have a problem and you have a problem with the spinal nerves here, we call it a pinched nerve. What happens then? Well, the signals that are supposedly coming in, so then it can make contact and then go up the brain on the opposite side. Well, if you have a problem with the spinal nerve and then you have a pinched nerve there, the signals for sensation can't get through. So you have a loss of sensation in that area. At the same time, motor signals can't get out. Because it can't get out, you have a loss of function in that same area of the deltoid, right? So keep in mind, in terms of my analogy for the highway system here, is that imagine what happens if you're on a freeway and if you're driving somewhere, you can't get out because the exit's blocked. Well, you're gonna have to, right? You're kind of stuck. You can't send the information through. Or the entrance ramp is blocked. Can't get on the freeway then. If the entrance ramp is stuck and blocked, right? So if you can't get on the freeway, you can't activate the neurons. You can't get to your location quite easily, right? In our body, it just can't get there at all because the only way to send that information to our brain to decipher is through the spinal cord. So in our analogy, it kind of should make a little bit of sense. Now, in terms of spinal cord, we're gonna see, in terms of spinal cord, I'm just gonna end the show for 1 second. Just wondering why none of these are highlighted. Okay, all right, I'll highlight these as we go through it so you guys can see what I want you guys to know. So when we look at the meninges, know what's a dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Now on Thursday, I'm gonna show you and we're gonna go through the anatomy on Anatomy and Physiology Revealed, right? So those are all kind of important things to know right here, right? What is the dura mater? What is the pia mater? What is the arachnoid mater? And then we'll talk about the spaces in just a second. So when we talk about these right here, the spinal cord, just like the brain, very, very soft, very fragile. So what we need to do is actually really protect it from damage. So one of the ways we have it for protection is we're gonna produce cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid bathes the spinal cord in the brain, so then it's equally protected and everything is in the middle. The spinal cord is medially located right here. There's fluid behind it that acts as a barrier. There's fluid in front of it. Perfect. Now, to make, right, besides the fluid that helps bathe it and protect, you have 3 layers of connective tissue that we call the meninges. The meninges are sometimes tough, sometimes not as dense and tough, but more functional, right? So the first one being very, very dense and tough is called the dura mater. Dura mater, durable matter. All right, now again, with all of these meninges, the meninges, like in meningitis, right? These meninges are continuous with the brain. So when we see in the spinal cord, they go up the foramen magnum and they completely enclose the brain too. So you'll have a dura mater, that's the most superficial, external-most region, real tough, real smooth. So then you have protection, right? Not only do you have protection, you have protection from our own real sharp areas of bone. So that dura mater is very important. If we didn't have a dura mater, we have a skull that's encasing and protecting our brain, but the skull itself is really sharp. Bone tissue is really sharp. So we need to protect our very fragile brain from its own sharp bone tissue. The dura mater is the first layer that helps in the protection. It's the most superficial and it acts as almost like a secondary bone. Then between the dura mater and the second mater is called the arachnoid mater. So this arachnoid mater is in this area that is between the dura and the, right? This dura mater is deep. This arachnoid mater is deep to the dura mater, right? Thin, wispy, and usually what's important about it is what we see deep to the arachnoid mater. So deep to the arachnoid mater in what we call the subarachnoid space. This subarachnoid space is where we're going to see our cerebrospinal fluid. So let me just get back there. So then I can show you guys this subarachnoid space. And I just want to highlight this. So this subarachnoid space, I want you to know what it is. Very important. And the epidural space as well, right? Let me just add these. Now, in the subarachnoid space, right here, in the subarachnoid space means that it's deep to the arachnoid mater. It's between the arachnoid mater and the deepest layer of our three meninges. The deepest layer is called the pia mater. The pia mater is intimate with the brain and the spinal cord, meaning that you can't remove the pia mater without actually damaging the brain and the spinal cord. So what we're gonna see again, three layers. The dura mater, toughest, most superficial. Continues with the spinal nerves as it exits out. So right here, here's a spinal nerve as it exits. The dura mater continues with the spinal nerves as they exit outwards. Then we have a little bit of space between the dura and the next mater. This is called the subdural space, right? The subdural space is filled with serous fluid, meaning it's really not that important. It's just there, it's like a lubrication. Now, the epidural space is important. The epidural space is where we inject anesthesia when people are having a spinal epidural. Now, you probably have friends or you remember your parents having kids. And when women have babies now, we can give them a spinal epidural. In a spinal epidural, we take a very long needle, right? The needle is about the longest needle you'll ever see. The needle then has to go from the back in the lumbar region. Why do we go in the lumbar region? Right? The reason why we go in the lumbar region is because it's safest, right? Remember, your spinal cord ends between L2 and L3, or L3 and L4 in that general area. So we want to go in the lumbar region because your spinal cord is no longer one tight functional cord. In other words, when it's a tight functional cord, you have individual nerves that comes down and it can't wiggle out of the way. So think about what happens if you're cooking spaghetti. When you're cooking spaghetti, you want to make sure that the spaghetti noodle's done. Have you ever tried to pick up one little spaghetti as you're cooking it with a fork? It's really hard, isn't it? To wrap your fork all the way around the spaghetti strand, pick it up, and then take a bite, right? Why is it so hard? Because the spaghetti has a lot of room to move around. Now, what happens when you drain the spaghetti in a colander? As you drain it, there's no more water there. So you can pick it up by your fingertips. Much easier. because there's no more wiggle room. So why am I making this analogy? Simple, right? Before the spinal cord ends, all of those spaghetti pieces are your nerves, right? And those nerves are all tightly bound together. Just like what happened if you drained your spaghetti. All those nerves are all bundled tight together when we have a functional spinal cord. That means anything above L3, right? You have a true cord, all those spinal nerves, right? All those nerves in general are all bundled tight into a cord. So if I do a spinal epidural and the needle goes through and it hits your spinal cord, each of the individual nerves are so bundled tight together, they can't wiggle out of the way. So my needle goes right through the nerve, and that can cause permanent damage when that happens. The good news is that it's pretty rare. Now, to make sure that we minimize the risk, we go below L3. Why? Below L3, you no longer have a true cord. Instead, you have individual nerves that exits out. They're no longer bundled tightly together as one spinal cord. So if I try, right, or even if I accidentally hit the nerve as it's no longer a functional cord, there's a lot of room now. Let's take a look what I mean here. There's a lot of wiggle room for these nerves, right? And if I accidentally hit one with a needle, what happens? They wiggle out of the way because they're no longer tightly bound as a cord. So it's like picking up the piece of spaghetti when it's still in with lots of water, right? You might hit it, but trying to pick it up, well, the spaghetti pieces just wiggle out of your way. So it makes it harder to pick up. At the same time, when we're trying to do a spinal epidural or a lumbar puncture, spinal tap, right? We go below L3 because it decreases the risk of me damaging the nerve. Even if my needle accidentally hits one of these yellow nerves, there's a lot of room now, right? If I hit it, they can wiggle out of the way. Perfect. If my nerve, right, if I hit a nerve and they're all bundled tight together up here, if I hit that nerve, there's no wiggle room, right? That nerve is clustered with other nerves next to it, next to those, and next to those. So there's no room to wiggle out of the way. So if my needle hits it, it goes right through that nerve and you will have permanent damage as a result. That's why we always go between, right, the L3, L4 vertebrae or between the L4, S1 vertebrae, right? So keep that in mind. It's so much safer then. Now, the last thing I want you to know is subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is deep to the arachnoid mater, right? It's found between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. The pia mater is adherent to the spinal cord and brain. This subarachnoid space right here, that's where all of the cerebrospinal fluid will be found. So when I'm doing a spinal epidural and when I'm doing a spinal tap, I go to different areas. In the spinal epidural, I go right through the ligamentum flavum, which is really tough. And then I release the lidocaine outside. As I release it outside of the dura mater, it covers the spinal nerves, numbs everything up. When I'm doing a lumbar puncture, I have to go through the dura mater, go through the arachnoid mater, and go to the small little space before I can withdraw some of the CSF, right? You go a little bit deeper and it's a little bit more scary. Every now and then, right, during labor and delivery, sometimes, or even during surgery, an anesthesiologist, when they're doing a spinal epidural, they go a little bit too deep, right? As they go a little bit too deep, they might actually hit the area of your cerebrospinal fluid, right? When that happens, there's a little bit of leakage that can happen, and people get bad spinal headaches as a result of it. It's just one of the things you have to sign off on when you are getting a spinal epidural, is that you do know, you take the risk that there is a chance that the needle can puncture through and you can have a little bit of CSF that leaks out. As that happens, Now your brain and spinal cord kind of freak out because there's not as much cerebrospinal fluid there, right? At that point, it can give you a bad headache, really bad headache, right? So let's look at the spinal cord on a diagram right here. Our spinal cord right here, if you take a look, here and here, it's divided in half. We're going to see that for all of our, whoops, right? We're going to see that for the brain as well, right? So the brain is going to be completely divided into left and right hemispheres. There's nothing that can go right through because there's a physical split between those two, a physical cut like we see here. So right here, there's a physical cut on the anterior portion of the spinal cord. So then there's a physical divide between it. There's a space. Now in the back, we have something different, just a little crease found between the two sides. But keep in mind though, there is that division, there is that crease, right? The crease is called a posterior median sulcus. A sulcus is a crease separating one region of spinal cord and brain from another region. The actual regions of the spinal cord where you do have nerves and neurons, those are called either gyrus, right, when we talk about the brain, or they're divided into columns when we talk about the spinal cord, right? The columns out here are going to be white for a reason, right? They're white because they're myelinated. So let's take a look at a real spinal cord section, right? So take a look at this. It kind of looks like a butterfly. The gray areas are the unmyelinated axons and cell bodies, right? So the cell bodies or somas of motor neurons, somas for sensory neurons, somas and cell bodies for, right, even interneurons. They're all found in this gray matter. So you see gray matter forming a butterfly-looking shape, surrounded by white matter. And those are myelinated axons that moves up and down as part of our superhighway of motor signals going up, coming down, and motor signals coming up, and sorry about that, sensory signals coming up, motor signals coming down. Now, if you take a look, right, it looks more like rust colored, but we can imagine it's gray, right? It's gray butterfly on the inside of our spinal cord. And then you see gray on the outside right here, right? It's gray out here because that's where our main sensory neurons have their cell bodies. So those sensory neurons, let's say of your fingertips, right? That allows you to touch and feel, right? Well, what we find in our fingers are just the axons, very long axons. The cell bodies of those axons, right, that allows us to feel are found near the spinal cord. In other words, the cell body is very far away from the actual end of the axon, the physical end of the cell itself. So you see the cell bodies here in gray or rust on each side. Those are going to be cell bodies for your sensory neurons, bringing the information from your limbs and your body to the spinal cord, right? We call that the dorsal root ganglia. Now, why do we call it the dorsal root ganglia, right? So if you take a look right here, here's a spinal nerve. As we get deeper, then you have this kind of bump right here. That bump is your dorsal root ganglia. That bump is the cell bodies of your sensory neurons. So on one side, the cell bodies are found here. They have an axon that comes out the spinal nerve, comes out the spinal nerve to your target tissue, like your fingertips, right? So the axon that comes out the spinal nerves will go to your fingertips. They'll be connected to touch receptors, to pain receptors, right? To temperature receptors, right? Any kind of sensation. So those axons come all the way out to your fingertips, and then the axons come all the way into the spinal cord. So what we're going to see is this in a all right, dorsal root ganglia, the cell bodies are located close to the spinal cord, but its axons come out towards your limbs and towards the spinal cord. So it's just one big, super long axon. All right, on one side of the axon is connected to your fingertips. On the other side is going to go into the spinal cord and then connect with a pathway that will then get triggered when you have that sensation. All right, the cell body found right in this dorsal root ganglia. Now you also have a ventral root. So all motor signals come out through the front. We call it the ventral root. All sensory signals comes from the back, right? So sensory signals, once they enter the spinal nerve, move closer to the spinal cord. Sensory signals are then separated, right? Once you go into the spinal cord, sensory signals cords move towards the back, towards the dorsal root. Motor signals move towards the front, the ventral root, right? Now, what else do we see, right? The dorsal root right here has a big bump, dorsal root ganglia. If you look at the ventral root, it's flat. Why is the ventral root flat and there's no bump here? There's no ventral root ganglia, right? The reason is this. The dorsal root ganglia, right? Ganglia means clusters of cell bodies outside of the spinal cord. So for all sensations, the cell bodies of neurons that carry sensation towards the spinal cord, right? Those cell bodies are found outside the spinal cord at the dorsal root, right? So as the cell bodies are found here in the dorsal root, we call it the dorsal root ganglia. The ganglia mean cell bodies outside the spinal cord. Now, it doesn't have to be very far outside the spinal cord. I mean, it's millimeters outside the spinal cord, right? Very, very close to the spinal cord, but it's not in the spinal cord. If it's in the spinal cord, we call it a nucleus, right? Again, clusters of cell bodies outside the spinal cord called ganglia. Clusters of cell bodies inside the spinal cord called nucleus. Now, the answer on why we don't have a ventral root ganglia, there's no bump here, is simple, right? The cell bodies of motor neurons are found here. They're found as part of the spinal cord. Because the cell bodies are found there, only the axons exit out. And those axons are flat. As they exit out, they form the ventral root. And since there's no cell body, the axons are flat, right? The cell bodies are not found out here. They're found in the spinal cord, right? They're found as a collection we call a nucleus. Again, why is it called a nucleus? Because a nucleus are cell bodies inside the spinal cord. How come we do have a dorsal root ganglia? Because for sensations, the neurons that carry the sensation in, those neurons have cell bodies outside the spinal cord, not inside, right? We call clusters of cell bodies when they're found outside a ganglia. So now we get the ganglia name. How come we have dorsal root? Because sensations always gets carried towards the dorsal aspect, the dorsal root. So the name tells us dorsal root ganglia, collection of cell bodies for sensation. Right now, roots and commissures, keep in mind that there's a physical separation here, right? Between the root, the two sides of the spinal cord. We're going to see exact same thing in the brain where we cut the hemispheres in half. In the spinal cord, same thing, right? Now, in the spinal cord, we have ways of crossing over. There are ways for sensations to carry their message to the opposite side. This can be very important when we talk about certain reflexes. You guys have all stubbed your toe before, right? When you stub your toe, you're gonna pick your leg up and start hopping on the opposite foot, right? opposite leg. All right, we call it the flexor withdrawal and the cross extensor reflex. Well, how do I get the other foot and the other leg to contract when the pain is on the opposite leg? So if I hurt my right toe, right pinky toe, what happens? I pick up my right leg, but I also want to prevent falling. So I need to put all my weight on my good left leg. Well, what happens is I can send a signal through commissures that crosses over from one side of the spinal cord to the next. If we were completely to cut off the commissures, we will not be able to have sensory or motor signals that crosses over. The commissures, both the gray and white commissure in certain areas of the spinal cord, allows signals to come in and then cross over to the opposite side. So when I hurt my toe, the pain signals comes into spinal cord, right? At the same time, I pick up my foot by causing my foot to contract. I also need to extend my opposite leg so then I don't fall over. Because before I was on two legs, now I need to be on one. So I need to send that signal to the opposite side. That's what the commissures allow us to do, right? Send a signal to the opposite leg, so then we have communication between both sides. Now in the brain, we're going to see that we have commissures as well. We call one of them the corpus callosum, and we'll talk about those later on. Roots. Spinal nerves arise as rootlets. These are the roots right here. Roots itself and rootlets form the roots, right? And again, in terms of when we get close to the spinal cord, the closer we are to the spinal cord, the more we separate sensory signals towards the back, motor signals exit out the front. Now, once we kind of go past the spinal cord, then we fuse all those signals together. As we have motor signals in the front and sensory signals in the back fused together, they form the spinal nerve. When they form the spinal nerve, all the signals get mixed up, right? In other words, when I cut, if I could cut this area right here, I could cut it in the back, I know those are all just sensory signals. If I cut it right here in the front, all of these are just motor signals. But if I would cut it at the spinal nerve level, right here, right? If I cut it right here, all of those signals get mixed together. As they get mixed together, right, you would assume that, oh, this is the back, right? That should only have sensory signals. Not true anymore, right? If I cut it right here and I look at that region behind, the dorsal region, what happens? You can have sensory and motor signals. If we look at the front, after we cut it, we're going to see that there's a mixture of sensory and motor signals as well. So once you immediately form the spinal nerves, right at the very beginning, when these guys fuse together, all of the sensory and motor signals cross over, right? By then, you can't tell which area is which. There's too much intermixing at that point. Now let's take a look at this picture. It's pretty cool, right? In terms of the dorsal root ganglia, right here, I'm just gonna end it so then I can highlight it. For some reason, these aren't highlighted, so we're gonna need a little bit of time to just go through this. All right, now, make it a little bigger. So here for the dorsal root ganglia, right? Again, on this model, this picture is pretty good. You can see the dorsal root ganglia includes our cell body, that big green circle, that's a cell body of our sensory neuron. These are kind of what we call unipolar neurons, where it just has one axon. The axon then splits going towards your extremity, and the axon goes down to your fingertips. Let's use our touch receptors still, right? As they go down your fingertip, when they get triggered for touch, the spinal nerve will send that signal from your fingertips. As they send it from your fingertips right here, right? The spinal nerve will form part of your, name nerve. So if it's your middle finger that you have touched something, or even better yet, you burned your finger while you're cooking, what happens at that signal activates pain receptors. Pain receptors fire, they trigger, right, our axon that sends a signal, because our middle finger sends a signal down the median nerve. The median nerve then carries the information into the spinal cord, right? As it goes in the spinal cord, that axon enters the spinal nerve. Since it's sensory, it stays posterior. As it stays posterior, it meets its own cell body here, and it enters the spinal cord by the dorsal root. As it enters by the dorsal root, then it can trigger, right, a pain response, right? We call it the flexor withdrawal response, or it can cause other responses, right? But we need to send that information inwards. So this is the pathway of bringing information from your fingers coming out here from the spinal nerve. If you have pain, right? Pain receptors fire, causing an action potential in my spinal nerve, my nerve. The nerve or the axon carries that information into the spinal cord by way of this pathway. Now, motor signals are different, all right? We have two, in terms of sensory signals, we just have sensation, that's it, right? We don't have two different forms, right? So what we can see in terms of motor signals is that we have two areas that could become activated. In sensory, just one, right? So dorsal root ganglia cell bodies of unipolar sensory neurons. So a unipolar neuron is a neuron that has a cell body and has one axon. Doesn't have dendrites, right? It's got one super long axon. Here, the axon ends in the spinal cord, and it continues all the way to the start, which is found in your fingertips. So it's a very long axon. When you have pain, sensation, right? You trigger the pain receptor, which causes your spinal nerves to fire an action potential, right? Then the neuron goes up your dorsal root and into the spinal cord. Now, motor neurons are there to trigger some kind of movement. The big difference is this, right? We have two main types of movements possible, right? Two main, right, categories of motor neurons. And we kind of mentioned it in chapter 11, right? And one of them is somatic motor neurons. Somatic motor neurons will go to skeletal muscles, and they are voluntary, right? Where number two, the second type of motor neurons are autonomic, right? So one is somatic, it goes to your skeletal muscles. The other category of motor neurons are what we call our autonomic motor neurons. And those motor neurons goes to your heart, goes to your GI tract, goes right to areas that are usually involuntary. So you can't control how fast your heart is beating. You can't control, right, your blood pressure because it's involuntary. Now, you can't control it voluntarily. You do have control in terms of subconscious, unconscious control. So the autonomic motor neurons then goes to your heart and blood vessels. So then in the blood vessels, you can constrict or relax, right? So what happens is that we have two main categories of motor neurons, right? There's only one main category of sensory neurons. All sensation goes to the back. All sensations coming in has their cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglia, right? There is no two categories of sensory neurons. There are two categories of motor neurons though, right? The first one, somatic motor neurons, goes to your skeletal muscles, and they are voluntary. What happens is they're found in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord is divided into white matter right here, right, that we call columns. So you have columns in the back. Those columns in the back are called the dorsal or posterior column. Then you have columns in the front. Those are called your anterior column, right? Now again, why is it white matter? The white matter because they're myelinated axon. So we're gonna see with the white matter here, these are myelinated axons that goes up into the spinal cord, up into the brain, or comes down from the brain. As those wires, the nerves come down from the brain, those nerves are all myelinated. And as they come downwards from the brain, those millions of myelinated axons all clustered together forms the white matter that can be found in the front, found in the lateral horn region, or found in the lateral column region, or found in the posterior dorsal column region. So again, dorsal, posterior the same, anterior, ventral is the same. So when you look at this, don't get confused. Anterior horn is ventral horn. Ventral root is anterior root. Right? Those two words can be used and are used interchangeably. Now, whereas the white matter are myelinated axons, and we call them columns. The gray matter are cell bodies and unmyelinated axons, and we categorize those clusters of cell bodies as horns. So we see an anterior horn, a lateral horn, and a posterior horn. And these are clusters of cell bodies, nucleus or nuclei, right, found in the spinal cord. Remember, the nuclei is a cluster of cell bodies in the spinal cord or brain. So we're going to see, right, lateral horn. What do we find there? We're going to find in the lateral horn cell bodies that are for your autonomic motor neuron, right? So autonomic motor neuron, let's say you're scared, right? Or you're watching a movie and you're getting kind of scared. What happens? Your heart rate starts to go up, right? Your breathing rate starts to increase. How does it increase? It increases because the cell body found in the lateral horn, those cell bodies have axons that exit out through the ventral root. Remember, these are still motor neurons, right? So as they exit out the ventral root right here, it exits out the ventral root, goes through the spinal nerve, goes through and makes contact with the second neuron found in your sympathetic ganglia, which they don't show here yet, and then it eventually ends up in the heart, right? So even when we're talking about autonomic functions that are non-voluntary, even then, we have a motor neuron that is there to activate, right? Involuntary doesn't mean you don't have motor neurons. It doesn't mean you don't have control. It means you don't have active control. That's what we mean by involuntary. We still have a motor neuron. The motor neuron has a cell body right here. Its axons exit out through the front. Why do they exit out through the ventral root? Because all motor neurons, doesn't matter if they're voluntary or involuntary, all motor neurons have axons that exits through the ventral root, right? Then it comes out, makes contact with the second neuron, which then makes contact with the heart and the lungs, increasing its activity because you're scared. Now, how about somatic movement? So let's say you want, you're at the doctor and the doctor wants to test your reflexes. As he tests your reflexes, he hits your patellar tendon. What happens then? As he hits your patellar tendon, hitting the patellar tendon causes a stretch reflex. That stretch reflex gets carried up your femoral nerve, which then ascends up and enters through the spinal nerve. As it goes through the spinal nerve, the axon comes up and enters through the dorsal root, right? As it goes and enters the dorsal root, it passes its own cell body. And then as it enters the dorsal root, it's going to be part of a pathway, a reflex arc, right? Where it makes contact with a second neuron, which then causes that muscle that you have just stretched, causes that muscle to contract, right? So this interneuron causes this motor neuron that's somatic. That somatic motor neuron will go to the stretched muscle, right? So you send that signal inwards that the muscle's been stretched, then you trigger the motor neuron, which sends its signal out through the ventral root and goes right into the stretched muscle, causing the muscle that's stretched to contract, right? So this is one nice reflex arc right here. Now, for this slide, if you know what's found in the lateral horn, what's found in the anterior or ventral horn, you'll be in good shape. Now, the posterior horn, we still have this in the back, right, also contains cell bodies. But these are cell bodies that form part of your sensory pathway, right? Remember, we have cell bodies and neurons that send the information into the spinal cord. But your spinal cord is not the main integration for your sensation. Your brain is. So we need to send that information from the spinal cord. We need to send it towards your brain on the opposite side. So what we're going to see is that one neuron isn't that long enough to do it. It takes 3 neurons to send a signal to the brain. This is just the first one. This is the first neuron. The first neuron sends the information to the spinal cord. The second neuron sends it from the spinal cord to your brainstem on the opposite side. And then the third neuron goes from your thalamus to a specific area of the brain. So the posterior horn contains cell bodies of pathways for sensation. That's all I want you to know right now, right? So horns include cell bodies. Cell bodies from the posterior horn are part of our sensory pathway that sends signals up to the brain. Cell bodies of the lateral horn, right, are found as part of our autonomic motor neurons, which controls your heart rate, controls your heart, your lungs, that kind of stuff, right? Cell bodies in the anterior horn will have motor functions for our skeletal muscles. So cell bodies on the anterior horn contain cell bodies for our somatic motor neurons that exits out and goes right to the target muscle. Perfect. If you understand those, you'll be in pretty good shape. Questions so far, guys? No? All right, let's take a little break. We come back. We will continue and talk about reflexes. Whoops. And we will then discuss, right, the rest of the, right, this chapter. Okay? Get this out. 5-minute break.